The Boeing that refused to fall. Bedtime history. It was supposed to be an ordinary flight. This is a disaster story, but more than that. It is a story of the human spirit that refuses to yield in the face of the inevitable. It would take only an hour from Tokyo to Osaka. But on an August evening in 1985, Japan Airlines Flight 123 would not complete its journey. What happened instead became, over 32 minutes, a testament to human courage against impossible odds. This is the story of the Boeing that refused to fall, and of the people who fought for every second in the sky. Some moments in history are defined not by a single catastrophic event, but by the minutes that follow the chain of events. On a day when the world seemed normal, a moment suddenly emerged filled with struggle, confusion, and quiet heroism. For the 524 lives aboard Japan Airlines 123, that moment arrived just 12 minutes after takeoff, with a deafening explosion. What followed, unfortunately, was not a swift and merciful end. It was a 32-minute fight for life, the crew battling with a crippled aircraft, the passengers clinging to their last shreds of hope against gravity itself. This is the story of a machine damaged beyond recognition, being kept in the air by the sheer will of those inside it. Chapter 1. The Calm Before the Storm. August 12, 1985. Tokyo's air had grown heavy with the heat of late summer. At Haneda, one of the busiest airports in the world with an average of 613 flights a day, the atmosphere seemed like its usual orderly chaos, continuing in the familiar rhythm of takeoffs and landings. But this was not an ordinary Monday evening. It was the eve of Obon, a beloved Japanese Buddhist festival traditionally beginning on the 13th day of the 7th month, during which families travel across the country to honor the spirits of their ancestors. The terminals were packed with people, businessmen eager to get home, students glowing with the promise of summer vacation, and countless families drawn together by the pull of home and tradition. Among them was the famous singer Kyu Sakamoto, who had won the world's heart with his song Ue o Muite Aruku, known in the West as Sukiyaki. He was traveling for work, a familiar routine. Elsewhere, two families of 4 were looking forward to the holiday. They were all individual lives with their own stories and hopes, about to be bound together soon by a shared fate. The aircraft waiting at the gate was a Boeing 747, short range, meaning it was the version of the legendary jumbo jet designed for the dense, short-haul routes that form the backbone of Japan's domestic flights. This aircraft was, quite literally, a workhorse. It had already completed 4 flights that day, crossing Japan from end to end with the reliability that made the Boeing 747 the queen of the skies. For the passengers boarding it, this was a symbol of safety, a gleaming tube promising a fast, trouble-free flight to Osaka. The flight crew was made up of experienced professionals. In command was 49-year-old Captain Masami Takahama, with over 12,000 hours of flight experience. He was a training captain, and on this flight he was supervising First Officer Yutaka Sasaki, who was training for his own promotion. With them was flight engineer Hiroshi Fukuda, a third set of eyes monitoring the aircraft's complex systems. The flight was nearly full. 509 passengers and 15 crew members took their seats. The doors closed, the safety briefing was given. The massive aircraft pushed back from the gate a few minutes behind schedule. At 6:12 p.m., Japan Airlines 123 roared down the runway as usual and rose gracefully into the evening sky under the setting sun. Below, the vast city of Tokyo began to shrink, its millions of lights shimmering like a fallen constellation. The seatbelt signs went off. Passengers began to relax and unwind. The cabin crew moved through the aisles with drinks and warm smiles. In every sense, this was a completely ordinary, trouble-free flight. The 747 was climbing steadily over Sagami Bay, approaching its cruising altitude of 24,000 feet. In the cockpit, the conversation was calm and professional. Outside, the setting sun painted the clouds in shades of orange and violet. Inside the cabin was a small world of ordinary moments. A child asleep on a parent's shoulder, a businessman reviewing his notes, a couple holding hands. It was 6:24 p.m. 12 minutes of purely ordinary normalcy had passed. And then, in an instant, that normalcy shattered. Chapter 2: The Incident and the Struggle. The first sign that something had gone terribly wrong was not a jolt, but a sound. A sudden, explosive noise tore through the cabin. For the passengers in the rear, the effect was terrifying. Ceiling panels tore away, and a thick white fog instantly filled the air, the cabin's humid atmosphere depressurizing against the thin, cold air outside. Alarms began to blare in the cockpit. The cabin pressure alarms screamed, confirming the sudden loss of pressure. At 24,000 feet, the outside air is too thin to breathe, and survival now depended on the emergency oxygen masks dropping from above. But the loss of pressure was only the beginning. The explosion had been caused by the catastrophic failure of the aircraft's aft pressure bulkhead. The domed metal wall at the very rear of the passenger cabin. When the bulkhead ruptured, the pressurized air inside the cabin burst into the unpressurized tail section with unimaginable force. This blast tore away a large portion of the iconic towering vertical tail fin that gave the 747 its stability. A huge section had simply ceased to exist. The destruction did not end there. Running the length of the tail were the aircraft's 4 independent hydraulic lines. The hydraulics were the muscles that moved the massive control surfaces, the ailerons, the elevators, and the rudder that allowed the pilots to steer. In an instant, all 4 of these vital lines were severed. In the cockpit, the situation was turning into controlled chaos. Flight engineer Fukuda urgently reported the loss of pressure across all 4 hydraulic systems. The gauges read 0. He could make no sense of it. The 747 had been designed with quadruple redundancy. First Officer Sasaki tried to move the controls, but there was no response at all. The control yoke felt lifeless. It could never be controlled. The aircraft could neither climb, nor turn, nor descend. The rudder that controlled sideways movement had physically ceased to exist. Just 4 minutes after the explosion, Captain Takahama radioed Tokyo Control with a chillingly calm message reporting the trouble and requesting an immediate return to Haneda. They declared an emergency. The pilots were now flying a 350-ton projectile. The crippled jet began to exhibit a terrifying motion known as a phugoid cycle. It would climb, its speed dropping dangerously. It would climb, its speed dropping dangerously. Then its nose would plunge violently into a dive before the cycle began again. Added to this was a nauseating side-to-side motion known as a Dutch roll. Witnesses on the ground described the plane flying like a drunken bird. For the next half hour, the 3 men in the cockpit fought one of the most extraordinary battles in aviation history. With no checklist for a failure of this kind, they began to improvise. They realized the only control left to them was engine thrust. By increasing power on one side and decreasing it on the other, they could try to turn the aircraft. By adjusting the power of all engines at once, they tried to counteract the violent climbing and diving. It was like trying to steer a sled down a mountain by shifting your weight. An extraordinary display of airmanship. Amid the blaring alarms, their communication remained clipped, focused, and utterly without panic. Air traffic controllers tried to guide them, offering vectors to Haneda and other nearby airports. But the crew, struggling just to keep the aircraft level, could not comply. When asked to turn, the captain's reply made their helplessness plain. The aircraft, he said, was now completely uncontrollable, and yet they did not give up. As the aircraft rocked and lurched, the cabin was a scene of controlled terror. But as the minutes passed and the mountains of the Izu Peninsula drew closer, the reality of their situation began to set in. The aircraft would not be able to land safely. Faced with the unthinkable, many people turned to a deeply human act. They began to write. On scraps of paper, on business cards, in notebooks, and on whatever paper they could find, they wrote their final goodbyes. These were not letters of anger or despair. They were messages full of love and gratitude. Fathers asking their children to look after one another and to take care of their mother. Others writing how grateful they felt for the life they had had. These were not the words of people panicking. These were the words of people facing the end with both clarity and tenderness, both heartbreaking and deeply moving. The struggle in the cockpit continued. As a final, desperate measure, they lowered the landing gear. The added drag helped ease the violent pitching, but it also made the aircraft harder to steer. The mountains drew closer, their dark slopes filling the cockpit windshield. The ground proximity warning system began sounding its urgent alarm. The crew responded, applying full power, their voices straining with tension. The aircraft, clearing a ridge by a hair's breadth, tried to climb. But their momentum was gone. The cockpit voice recorder captured the captain's final, urgent commands to his crew. One last, desperate struggle to save the aircraft. The right wing struck a line of trees. The impact sent the massive 747 into an uncontrollable roll. The aircraft turned over and struck the side of a mountain. The time was approximately 6:56 p.m. 32 minutes after the explosion, the long, agonizing struggle of Japan Airlines 123 had come to an end. Chapter 3, The Inevitable and Its Aftermath. The impact was of catastrophic scale. The force of the crash tore the Boeing 747 apart, scattered wreckage, and ignited a fireball that lit up the twilight sky. The crash site was a steep, densely forested mountainside in Gunma Prefecture on Mount Takamagahara, but it would become known to the world as Osutaka Ridge. A U.S. Air Force aircraft was among the first to spot the burning wreckage and immediately reported the coordinates to Japanese authorities. A Japan Self-Defense Forces helicopter also flew over the area, but the pilot, looking down through the darkness and smoke, reported finding no sign of survivors. Combined with the extreme difficulty of the terrain, this report led to a fateful and tragic decision. The official rescue operation was postponed until morning. But on that dark, cold mountainside, amid the twisted metal, there were signs of life. There were people who had survived the impact. An off-duty flight attendant, pinned between the seats, woke in pitch darkness. She could hear the voices of other survivors nearby, pained groans, quiet cries for help. At one point, she heard the sound of a helicopter's rotors above her and let herself hope. But the sound passed, fading into the distance. And then, slowly, painfully, over the long, cold night, the voices around her faded away one by one until only silence remained. The decision to delay the rescue became known as one of the most painful aspects of the tragedy. Doctors later determined that some passengers had survived the impact but died of their injuries or from the cold during the 14 hours spent waiting for help to arrive. When dawn finally broke, the rescue teams arrived at a scene of utter devastation. And yet, in the midst of it all, there was a miracle. A rescuer spotted movement. There, trapped but conscious, was the off-duty flight attendant. and she was not alone. Searchers soon found a mother and her young daughter alive in an intact section of the aircraft. Then a fourth survivor was found, a schoolgirl, badly injured but alive, found in the branches of a tree. These four people seated in the rearmost rows of the aircraft were the only survivors. 520 people, including all 15 crew members, had lost their lives. This remains, to this day, the deadliest single aircraft accident in history. The recovery effort that followed was a dark and immense undertaking. The farewell notes were gathered with great care, a tangible, heartbreaking bond to the humanity lost on that mountain. In the wake of the crash, Japan entered a period of deep mourning and searching for answers. How could this have happened? Chapter 4: The Why and the Legacy. The investigation soon turned to the aircraft's maintenance records, and a significant event came to light. 7 years earlier, in 1978, the same aircraft had suffered a tail strike on landing. Its tail had scraped the runway. The damage to the aft pressure bulkhead had been considered repairable. Manufacturer Boeing's repair plan called for the damaged section to be reinforced with a single continuous splice plate and 3 rows of rivets. But the technicians who carried out the repair deviated from the plan. Instead of one continuous plate, they used 2 separate pieces. Structurally, this was a critical flaw. One of the 3 rows of rivets became ineffective, dramatically increasing the stress on the other 2. The official investigation concluded that this faulty repair reduced the bulkhead's resistance to metal fatigue by roughly 70%. It was a ticking time bomb. Over the next 7 years, with every flight, the fuselage pressurized and depressurized. Small fatigue cracks began forming around the overstressed rivet holes. The aircraft flew more than 12,000 times after the faulty repair. Flight 123 was one flight too many. On that flight, as the aircraft climbed, the weakened panel finally gave way, setting off an irreversible chain of events. The revelation of the faulty repair sent shock waves through the aviation industry. The official report placed primary responsibility on the flawed repair and on the inspectors who failed to detect it in the years that followed. What came after was a period of intense soul-searching. The president of Japan Airlines resigned. It was reported that a maintenance manager and an engineer connected to the original repair, overwhelmed by a sense of responsibility, later took their own lives, a quiet, devastating footnote to the tragedy. Lasting change was born out of this great tragedy. This disaster became a landmark case study, contributing to significant changes in maintenance procedures, inspection protocols, and safety culture across the industry. Regulators mandated stricter inspections of critical structural components. The crash also spurred research into backup flight control systems so that pilots would never again be left as helpless as Captain Takahama and his crew. For Japan Airlines, the crash became a searing, defining part of its identity. In 2006, the company established a safety promotion center near Haneda Airport, a solemn training facility. On display, there are wreckage fragments from the crash, a reconstruction of the faulty bulkhead repair, and the farewell notes preserved behind glass. This tragic disaster was made into a step that every new Japan Airlines employee is required to take to confront the consequences of failure and to internalize the commitment that such a tragedy must never happen again. Every year on August 12th, the families of the victims make a pilgrimage to the crash site on Osutaka Ridge, a place transformed over 4 decades from horror into remembrance and peace. Chapter 5: A Reflective Close. At its core, the story of Japan Airlines 123 is a story about people. It is the story of three pilots who, faced with an impossible situation, fought for 32 minutes with extraordinary skill and courage, trying to keep their crippled machine in the sky. It is the story of flight attendants who kept their composure in the face of horror, and of passengers who chose, in their final moments, to write love instead of fear. The lessons learned from this disaster were written into the regulations that make air travel safer for all of us today. In that sense, the 520 lives lost were not lost in vain. But this story also reminds us how fragile an ordinary day can be, how quickly the everyday can shatter and reveal the character beneath it. It points to the quiet heroism that can emerge in the darkest of times, and to the deep, instinctive need to connect, to leave one last word of love, even as everything else is being stripped away. In the quiet halls of the Safety Promotion Center, and on the quiet forested slopes of a mountain in Gunma, the legacy of Flight 123 is carefully preserved. It stands not only as a permanent reminder of a great tragedy, but also of the enduring strength of the human spirit. It is a story of loss, but also of love, of resilience, and of a quiet promise we must never forget. And as we drift off to sleep, we may let that promise settle gently over us. Assumptions can be decisions that darken a life. To the 520 souls who boarded that evening flight and never completed their journey home, rest now, gently, among the mountains that hold you. May the love in your final words continue to be heard. May those who mourn you find peace, and may the sky you once crossed be calm and kind to all who follow after you.